Dr. Samuel Hartwell had examined thousands of photographs in his 20-year career as a historical archivist, but something about this particular image made him pause. The spring afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Connecticut Historical Society, casting long shadows across his cluttered desk. Before him lay a sepia-toned photograph from 1895, donated by the estate of the recently deceased Victoria Ashford, last surviving member of one of New England's most prominent industrial families. The photograph showed a formal family portrait taken in front of an imposing Victorian mansion. 5 figures stood arranged on the front steps. A stern-looking man in his 40s wearing an expensive suit, a woman in an elaborate dress with her hair perfectly coiffed, 2 teenage boys in matching jackets, and a small girl of perhaps 7 or 8 years old standing slightly apart from the others. The composition was typical of the era, stiff, formal, everyone staring directly at the camera with the serious expressions common before photography became casual. Samuel lifted his magnifying glass, beginning his routine documentation process. He noted the architectural details of the house, the style of clothing, the photographic technique. Then he moved to examine each family member more closely, noting details for the archive catalog. When he reached the young girl, something caught his attention. Her expression seemed different from the others, not merely serious, but haunted. Her eyes held a depth of emotion unusual for a child's portrait of that era. He adjusted the magnifying glass, moving down to examine her small hands, clasped in front of her white dress. Then his breath caught in his throat. There, barely visible in the aged photograph, but unmistakable once noticed, were dark stains on her pale fingers. Entangled between those small fingers, strands of what appeared to be human hair. Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his high-powered digital microscope, a tool he used for examining delicate historical documents. He carefully positioned the photograph under the lens and zoomed in on the child's hands. The image on his computer screen confirmed what he'd glimpsed through the magnifying glass, but with horrifying clarity. Dark stains covered the girl's right hand, concentrated around her fingertips and streaked across her palm. The coloration was inconsistent with the sepia tones of the aged photograph. These marks had been there when the picture was taken, and clutched between her thumb and forefinger were several long strands of dark hair, clearly visible against the white fabric of her dress. But it was what he saw next that made him push back from his desk. Along the edge of her sleeve, near the wrist, was a small spatter pattern. Samuel had consulted on enough historical crime documentation to recognize what he was looking at. That pattern was consistent with blood splatter. The photograph had been taken in 1895, during the height of the Gilded Age, when wealthy families like the Ashfords carefully cultivated their public image. Every detail of such a portrait would have been meticulously planned and staged. The photographer would have spent considerable time positioning each family member, adjusting their clothing, ensuring everything appeared perfect. How could no one have noticed a child standing there with blood on her hands and hair clutched between her fingers? Unless they had noticed. Unless they chose to take the photograph anyway. Samuel glanced at the accompanying documents from the estate. The donation letter identified the family, industrialist William Ashford, his wife Caroline, their sons Thomas and Edward, and their daughter Grace. The photograph had been found in a locked trunk in the attic of the family's abandoned estate, along with other personal papers. His mind raced with questions. What had happened before this photograph was taken? Whose blood was on that child's hands? And why would a family choose to preserve such a disturbing image? Samuel spent the next morning in the Historical Society's archives, pulling every file related to the Ashford family. The collection was extensive. The Ashfords had been prominent textile mill owners in Connecticut, with factories throughout the region employing hundreds of workers. News clippings documented their business success, their charitable donations, their elaborate social events. He found the original deed to their mansion, built in 1889 on a sprawling estate overlooking the Connecticut River. Society pages described lavish parties attended by governors and business magnates. But Samuel was searching for something else, any mention of tragedy, scandal, or unusual events in 1895. After 3 hours of searching, he found it. A small article from the Hartford Courant, dated October 15th, 1895, buried in the back pages. The headline read, "Ashford Household Mourns Sudden Loss." The brief article stated that Margaret Sullivan, a governess employed by the Ashford family, had died unexpectedly at their residence. The death was attributed to a tragic fall down the main staircase. She was 26 years old. The family declined to comment further, requesting privacy in their time of grief. Samuel sat back, his pulse quickening. A governess, a fall. A death in the same house, the same year as the photograph. He pulled up the image on his screen again, zooming in on young Grace's haunted eyes, on the dark stains and tangled hair in her small hands. He needed more information. The article mentioned that Miss Sullivan had been buried in Cedar Hill Cemetery. Cemetery records often contain details that newspapers omitted: family information, cause of death, who paid for the burial. He gathered his materials and headed for his car. The October afternoon had turned gray and cold as he drove through the winding roads toward the old cemetery, his mind churning with possibilities. If the governess died in October and the photograph was taken around the same time, could there be a connection? Cedar Hill Cemetery sprawled across 15 acres of rolling hills, its weathered headstones dating back to the 1700s. The administrative office was housed in a small stone building near the entrance. Inside, an elderly caretaker named Robert looked up from his desk as Samuel entered. After explaining his research, Robert led him to a dusty filing cabinet containing burial records from the 1890s. Together, they searched until they found the entry for Margaret Sullivan. The record listed her age, date of death, and burial plot number, but there was an additional notation that made Samuel's stomach tighten. Burial expenses paid by Ashford family. Closed casket service, immediate family only. Why would a wealthy family pay for their employees' burial and then restrict the service? Samuel thanked Robert and made his way to the burial plot, located in a quiet corner of the cemetery beneath an old oak tree. The headstone was simple gray granite, weathered by over a century of New England winters. The inscription read simply, Margaret Sullivan, 1869-1895, gone too soon. Samuel photographed the headstone, then noticed something unusual. The ground around the grave showed signs of recent disturbance, fresh dirt near the base of the stone as if someone had been digging. He knelt down, examining the area more closely. Partially buried in the loose soil was a small, tarnished metal object. He carefully extracted it and brushed away the dirt. It was a locket, old and corroded, but still intact. His hands shaking, Samuel opened it. Inside was a tiny photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and dark hair. On the opposite side was an inscription, barely legible. To Margaret, with love and hope. May you find happiness in your new position. This was her. This was the governess who died in the Ashford house. And someone had recently been here at her grave, perhaps trying to bury this locket. Samuel pocketed the item carefully and headed back to his car, his mind racing. He needed to find out more about Margaret Sullivan, who she was, where she came from, and what really happened in that house in October 1895. Samuel's next lead came from an unexpected source. While researching Margaret Sullivan's background, he found her listed in the 1895 city directory as residing at a boarding house on Chapel Street before taking the position with the Ashfords. The building was long gone, but property records led him to discover that the boarding house had been run by a woman named Catherine Murphy. A genealogy database revealed that Catherine's great-great-granddaughter, Ellen Murphy, still lived in Connecticut. Samuel called her that evening, introducing himself and explaining his research. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You're asking about Margaret Sullivan," Ellen said slowly. "My grandmother used to tell stories about her. Catherine kept a diary. I have it here. She wrote about Margaret often." 2 days later, Samuel sat in Ellen's living room in a modest house in New Haven. The diary was a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and fragile. Ellen had marked several entries with paper tabs. Samuel began reading, and the story that emerged made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Margaret Sullivan had been bright, educated, and ambitious. She'd taken the position with the Ashfords, hoping to save money to attend teachers' college. Catherine's diary entries described her as gentle and devoted to the children, particularly young Grace. But the entries from September and October 1895 took a darker turn. September 20th. Margaret returned for her day off today. She seemed troubled, though she tried to hide it. When pressed, she admitted that Mrs. Ashford has been behaving strangely, fits of rage, followed by periods of confusion. The family keeps it quiet, but Margaret fears for the children. October 3rd. Margaret came by unexpectedly this morning, visibly shaken. She said Mrs. Ashford's condition is worsening. Yesterday she found Mrs. Ashford in Grace's room in the middle of the night, standing over the sleeping child with scissors in her hand. Margaret managed to calm her and lead her away, but she's terrified of what might happen. Samuel leaned forward, completely absorbed in Catherine's neat handwriting. The next entries painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Ellen sat quietly across from him, her hands folded in her lap as he continued reading. October 10th. Margaret confided something today that frightens me deeply. She believes Mrs. Ashford is suffering from some form of mental deterioration. The woman has episodes where she doesn't recognize her own children. Sometimes she becomes convinced that the servants are plotting against her. Mr. Ashford refuses to acknowledge the problem, insisting his wife is merely tired or unwell. He's forbidden Margaret from discussing it with anyone. But Margaret said young Grace has become withdrawn and fearful. The child barely speaks anymore. October 12th. I begged Margaret to leave that house. The situation is dangerous, but she feels she cannot abandon the children, especially Grace, who has grown attached to her. She said Grace follows her everywhere, afraid to be alone with her mother. My heart breaks for that poor child. The next entry was dated October 14th, one day before the newspaper reported Margaret's death. Samuel's hands trembled as he read. October 14th. Margaret arrived at my door tonight after dark, distraught and covered in bruises. She said Mrs. Ashford attacked her this afternoon in a fit of rage, accusing her of trying to steal her children. Grace witnessed the entire incident and tried to intervene. Margaret managed to escape to her room and lock the door. She wanted to leave immediately, but she's terrified for Grace. Mr. Ashford was away on business. She didn't know what to do. I convinced her to stay here tonight, to rest and make a plan in the morning. She finally agreed, but she kept saying she had to go back, that she couldn't leave Grace alone in that house. The next entry, dated October 16th, was brief and written in a shaky hand. Margaret is dead. They say she fell down the stairs. I don't believe it. God forgive me, I don't believe a word of it. Samuel looked up at Ellen, who was watching him with knowing eyes. Your grandmother knew, he said quietly. She knew, Ellen confirmed. But who would have believed her? The Ashfords were powerful. She was just an immigrant woman running a boarding house. Armed with Catherine's diary, Samuel began searching for any official investigation into Margaret's death. The Connecticut State Archives held coroner's reports from that era, though many had been lost or damaged over the years. After 2 days of searching through brittle documents and temperature-controlled storage, he found it. The coroner's report on Margaret Sullivan was perfunctory, barely a page long. Cause of death, broken neck, consistent with a fall down a staircase. Time of death, estimated between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. on October 15th. Location, Ashford residence main staircase. The report noted contusions on her arms and neck, but attributed them to the fall. No autopsy had been performed. The case was closed the same day. What troubled Samuel was what wasn't in the report. No witness statements. No interview with the family. No description of the scene beyond the location. It was as if someone had wanted the matter resolved and forgotten as quickly as possible. He found a reference to the investigating officer, Detective James Morrison, Hartford Police Department. Tracking down information about a policeman from 1895 proved challenging, but Samuel eventually located his personnel file at the city records office. Morrison had resigned from the police force in December 1895, just 2 months after Margaret's death. The file contained no explanation for his resignation. However, a newspaper clipping from 1896 mentioned that Morrison had moved his family to Boston, where he took a position as a private security consultant. The article included a detail that made Samuel's pulse quicken. Morrison's new employer was the Ashford Textile Company's Boston office, a payoff. Morrison had been bought off, then given a comfortable job far from Hartford, where he couldn't be questioned. Samuel was now certain he was looking at a covered-up murder, but he needed proof. He needed to understand exactly what happened that day, and why that photograph was taken with a traumatized child still bearing physical evidence of violence. He pulled up the photograph again on his laptop, studying every detail. Then he noticed something he'd missed before. In the background, barely visible in the shadow of the doorway behind the family, was the blurred figure of another person. Samuel used advanced photo enhancement software, carefully adjusting the exposure and contrast on the shadowy doorway. Slowly, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, partially obscured by the door frame, but unmistakably watching the family portrait being taken. She appeared to be middle-aged, wearing a simple dark dress, her face turned toward the camera. He enlarged the image further. The woman's expression was one of barely contained horror. Her hand was raised to her mouth, and her eyes were fixed on young Grace. Samuel cross-referenced the image with household records from the Ashford estate. He'd found these earlier, but hadn't examined them closely. The 1895 household employed 12 servants, including 2 maids, a cook, a butler, a groundskeeper, a coachman, and several others. One name jumped out: Martha Brennan, listed as head housemaid. A search through immigration records revealed that Martha Brennan had arrived from Ireland in 1878, aged 18. She'd worked for the Ashfords since 1885, making her one of their longest-serving employees. But her name disappeared from household records after 1895. Samuel found her death certificate. She'd died in 1942 at age 82 in a Catholic nursing home in Providence, Rhode Island. But more importantly, he discovered that she'd given an interview to a student researcher in 1940 as part of an oral history project documenting Irish immigrant experiences. The interview transcript was archived at Brown University. 2 days later, Samuel sat in the university library, reading Martha Brennan's words from 45 years after the events. The interviewer had asked her about her time working for wealthy families. Martha's response, buried in pages of mundane recollections, suddenly turned dark. There was one house I worked in, I won't say which family, where terrible things happened. A young woman, a governess, she died there. They said it was an accident, but I knew better. I saw what happened that day, and I've carried the burden of silence for 45 years. The mistress of the house, she'd lost her mind. We all knew it, but the master refused to see it or admit it. That poor governess tried to protect the children, especially the little girl, and she paid for it with her life. Samuel's hands shook as he continued reading Martha's testimony. The interviewer had pressed for details, and Martha, perhaps unburdened by age and the passage of time, finally told the truth. It happened on an October afternoon. The master was away on business, as he often was. The mistress had been in one of her states all day, agitated, paranoid. Miss Sullivan, the governess, was trying to keep the children occupied and away from their mother. But little Grace wandered into the drawing room where her mother was sitting. I heard raised voices, then screaming. I ran toward the sound. Martha's testimony grew more detailed. When I reached the hallway, I saw the mistress at the top of the main staircase, her hands around Miss Sullivan's throat. The governess's face was already turning purple. Little Grace was there too, pulling at her mother's skirts, screaming for her to stop. But the mistress was beyond reason. She shook Miss Sullivan violently, then pushed her. I watched that poor girl tumble down those stairs, her neck breaking against the banister halfway down. Samuel felt sick as he read on. Martha described Grace running down the stairs to Margaret, trying to wake her, getting blood on her hands and pulling at Margaret's hair as she begged her not to be dead. Martha had pulled the child away while the mistress stood at the top of the stairs, suddenly calm, as if nothing had happened. The master returned within 2 hours. I told him everything. But instead of calling for the police, he called for the doctor. Not for Miss Sullivan, who was beyond help, but for his wife. The doctor gave her a sedative and spoke privately with the master. Then the master told us servants that if we spoke a word of what happened, we'd be dismissed without references, and our families would be ruined. He had that much power. The police were called, but Detective Morrison, he was in the master's pocket. It was ruled an accident within hours, but it was Martha's final words that explained the photograph. The next day, a photographer came to the house. The master insisted on having a family portrait taken, right there in front of the house, with everything looking normal and proper. Little Grace was still in shock, hadn't spoken since the day before. She still had blood under her fingernails. I'd tried to clean her up, but she wouldn't let anyone touch her hands. She kept them closed tight, clutching strands of Miss Sullivan's hair she'd pulled out. Samuel closed the transcript and sat in silence in the library reading room. The photograph now made terrible sense. William Ashford had taken that portrait not despite the horror of the previous day, but because of it. It was an assertion of control, a public declaration that his family was untouched by scandal. The fact that his traumatized 7-year-old daughter stood there with visible evidence of violence on her hands showed just how deeply he believed in his own untouchability. But why had the photograph survived? Why keep such damning evidence? Samuel returned to the Historical Society and examined the other items from Victoria Ashford's estate. Among them was a leather journal, which he'd initially set aside. He opened it now and found it was Grace's diary, begun when she was 16 and continued sporadically throughout her life. The first entry, dated September 1904, read, "I found the photograph today in Father's study. He keeps it locked in his desk drawer. I remember that day so clearly, though I was only 7. I remember Margaret's hair still clutched in my hand, the way no one would look at me, how Father made us stand there pretending nothing had happened. I think he keeps the photograph as a reminder of his power, of how he controlled everything. But one day, I'll tell the truth. I promise you, Margaret, I'll tell the truth." Grace never did tell the truth during her lifetime. Her later diary entries revealed that her mother was quietly institutionalized in 1897 and died there in 1902. Her father maintained his iron grip on the family until his death in 1920. Grace never married, never had children. She devoted her life to education reform and supporting orphanages, spending the fortune she inherited on helping vulnerable children. And the final diary entry, dated 2023, was written in a shaky hand. "I am 93 years old, the last of my family. I've sealed the truth in this trunk, the photograph, the diary, everything. Let whoever finds it know what happened to Margaret Sullivan. Let her death finally be acknowledged. I was too frightened to speak when I was young, too conditioned to silence by the time I was old enough to act. This is my final testimony. Margaret, I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I hope this gives you peace at last." Samuel sat at his desk as autumn rain began to fall outside. He would write the full story, document every piece of evidence, and submit it for publication. Margaret Sullivan's death would finally be recognized for what it was: murder, covered up by wealth and power. And Grace's long silence, born of trauma and maintained by fear, would end at last. The photograph, that disturbing image of a family pretending normalcy while a child clutched the evidence of violence in her small hands, would become a testament to a truth that could be buried but never erased. In his office, Samuel carefully archived every document, every piece of evidence. He looked once more at the photograph, at young Grace's haunted eyes staring across more than a century. "Your story will be told now," he said softly to that long-ago child. "Both of your stories." And for the first time since beginning this investigation, Samuel felt that perhaps some small measure of justice, however delayed, could still be achieved. The truth, once buried in silence and sealed in a locked trunk, had finally come to light.